This dot represents the English language. It's one of over 6,900 other languages in the world. A human child can pick up any language very easily without being taught, just by being naturally exposed to it. This means you can take a child from Japan and drop them off for a couple of years in Africa, or in Canada, or anywhere else in the world, and they will learn the local language just like that. And this doesn't just apply to speaking. A deaf child whose parents use sign language will pick up the vocabulary and grammar of that language in exactly the same way. So it's clear that we don't learn language from scratch. We're actually born with a kind of template which tells our brains the basic building blocks of all languages. When children hear new languages, they simply fill in the details. You don't have to speak any other foreign language to be a linguist. Like other scientists, linguists collect observations. They try to break them down into their basic building blocks. Then they create theoretical models and try to explain how it all works. There are many distinct branches of linguistics that focus on different things. Everything from speech sounds to the impact of social context on meaning. This gives linguists the skills to pursue a wide variety of jobs, represented here by these colorful sponges. Those who specialize in sound can go into fields like speech therapy or computer speech recognition. Those who specialize in meaning can go into fields like artificial intelligence, law, design, marketing, or translation. Those who specialize in the social dimensions of language can go into fields like policy or consumer research. Human beings produce hundreds, perhaps thousands of speech sounds, depending on how you count. This includes vowels like ah, fricatives like s, clicks like and many other sounds. Humans also produce sounds that are not speech sounds. The linguists who The linguists who study speech sounds are called phoneticians. One of the tools phoneticians use to describe sounds is the International Phonetic Alphabet, or IPA. Here is International Phonetic Alphabet in International Phonetic Alphabet. That's if you're American. Here it is in British English. International. International. Linguists use these symbols to transcribe and compare the sounds people make independent of written language or subjective perception. To identify these sounds, linguists use visual observations and tools like X-rays and MRI. They also look at spectrographs like this one. In fact, even linguistics undergrads learn how to identify what is being said just by looking at a spectrograph. To keep things simple, here are just the basic vowels across languages. Vowels are shown here by their position in the mouth. For example, the English sound E is pronounced with the tongue in front position, high in the mouth. If I take this sound and move my tongue back, I'll get the Russian sound E. E. If instead I move my tongue down, I'll get the English sound A, or even lower, the Russian sound A. Yeah. Some vowels are called rounded because we round our lips, like when we say the English high back oo. If I move that to the front, I get the French sound U. Ooh. Many of these vowels can also be nasal, like the French sound on. They can also be long, short, or diphthong to thongs, like in the word hey. Besides individual sounds, phonologists also study sound rules. For example, when you say, "I don't believe him," you're actually saying believe, with a final f. This is because English has a devoicing rule in this context. But when I say believe me, the voiced m sound causes v to remain voiced. Believe me. Each language has tons of its own sound rules. Phoneticists are not to be confused with phonologists. Phonologists also deal with sounds, but they look at the mental representations of sounds, called phonemes. Not phonies, phonemes.
Oh.
For example, the words pat and bat mean different things in English, because b and p are stored in my brain as separate phonemes. On the other hand, the word pat and pat are the same word in English. In my brain, there's only one phoneme. This same phoneme manifests as different sounds. Pat, pat. The cool thing is that what's true for English isn't true for other languages. For example, in Hindi, pal means fruit, while pal means a moment. These examples are called minimal pairs. Linguists love minimal pairs the same way that mathematicians love proofs. That's because a minimal pair proves that a sound difference is phonemic or not in a given language. When a sound difference is not phonemic, it means that speakers of that language will typically perceive the sounds as the same. Morphophonology is the intersection of morphology and phonology. An intersection is the part of things that overlaps. Morphology deals with sound change that happens when morphemes combine. For example, to a phonologist, the words cats, dogs, and horses end in different phonemes. However, to a morphophonologist, they all end in the same morphophoneme z, which has the meaning of many. When it follows a voiceless sound, like t in cats, it becomes voiceless. Cats. When it follows a voiced sound, like the g in dogs, it stays voiced. Dogs. When it follows a s sound that's already in the word, we insert a to separate them. Horses. Morphophonologists use linguistic models to describe these sorts of rules. This example proposes a sequence of sound rules. Syntax is the study of word order. Morphemes join up to form words, and words join up to form sentences. Models like this create testable hypotheses about how the brain forms, interprets, and transforms sentences. For example, let's say I bought a design book. But let's say you don't know what kind of book I bought. We'll represent this unknown with the word which. Which book? Now let's move which to a more typical position at the front of the sentence. To do this, we have to inject the helping verb to do. And to do then snatches the past tense from the verb buy. Now this looks right. Which book did John buy? But notice the verb buy now doesn't have a thing next to it. And this isn't allowed. You can't say John bought. You have to say John bought something. This is called transitivity. So let's create a theory to explain this gap. Let's say that when the book left, it actually left a trace. That is, on the surface level of language, the book is at the front of the sentence. But in the underlying representation, in our minds, the book is still where it's supposed to be, right next to the verb. Let's mark this trace with a small t. But is this a useful abstraction, or is this how the brain actually works? The people who test linguistic hypotheses are called psycholinguists. These are psychologists who set up experiments to study how we process words and sentences. For example, it turns out that when people hear the sentence, "Which book did John buy?" the brain accesses the word book from its dictionary, and then it looks up the word book again when you get to the trace position. This means linguists use real-world data to create theories and models. They can use these models to make predictions, and they can devise ways of testing these predictions and refine their theories. Psycholinguists are fascinated by how the brain retrieves words from our mental dictionaries. In fact, they can measure how long it takes the brain to do this. And based on the results of experiments, psycholinguists can propose different theories of how this retrieval actually works. For example, does it take longer to access the word crocodile or dial? Turns out that we access crocodile 50% faster, even though it's longer. Linguists who study meaning are called semanticists. One way they study language is by transcribing sentences into propositional logic. For example, the sentence, "all cats are cute," becomes, this means, for all things in the universe, if it's a cat, then it's cute. And a sentence like, John saw a cat, becomes, something exists such that it's a cat and John saw it. Semanticists also use tree models, but they do this to show how pieces of propositional logic combine to form a sentence. They also create entity diagrams like this. These kinds of formal models allow us to test very specific rules of language. For example, we can use this model to see if sentences like this mean the same things. Semanticists also do a lot of thought experiments to test the rules of meaning. For example, "Excuse me, how do I get to the Eiffel Tower?" "Oh, the Eiffel Tower was built in 1889. This exchange sounds odd, which tells us that some rule has been broken. In this case, we call it the maxim of relevance. Other rules are more subtle. For example, what if I said, "The Queen of the United States is 90 years old." This sounds weird because the US has no queen, so how can someone that doesn't exist be 90 years old? But is this sentence false? Well, if this sentence is false, then the opposite of it must be true. Let's see if that holds. The Queen of the United States is not 90 years old. This still sounds weird because, again, there is no queen. This is called a presupposition failure. It means the sentences aren't true or false. They presuppose something that is false. Or consider this example. This is Mary. She's talking to the police. Mary didn't know that Max crashed her car. In fact, Max didn't crash her car. Does this sound a bit odd? Well, how about this? Mary didn't know that Max crashed her car. In fact, she doesn't own a car. This sounds odd, and it's not a matter of telling the truth. Mary could be telling the truth or lying that she didn't know. But saying that Mary didn't know that Max crashed her car presupposes that Mary knows someone named Max, that Mary owns a car, and that Max crashed the car. Whether this statement is true, whether Mary actually didn't know or she's lying, is a completely different matter. These kinds of questions may seem unnecessarily convoluted, but imagine you're in court accused of a crime because of something you said. What did you mean? Or imagine this scenario. You're in a room, the window's open, and you're cold. So you say, "Geez, it's chilly in here." I would obviously recognize that you made a request to close the window. We do this all the time, like when we want someone to go already, but we want to be polite, so we say, "It's getting late." Now what if you had a robotic servant? How would you teach the robot to interpret this kind of request? Or what if you asked your robot to bring you a few cookies? How many is that? You would need to describe this meaning in programming code in a very precise way. There are other kinds of linguists as well, but you can learn more about those on your own damn time. For example, sociolinguists are anthropologists or sociologists who study how language interacts with culture, things like class and gender. They look at the geographic distribution of languages, how languages influence or even replace one another. Historical linguists touch on history, geography, and archaeology. For example, by comparing sounds across many languages, they can describe the natural patterns of sound change. They can then use these patterns to reconstruct what ancient languages might have sounded like hundreds or even thousands of years ago. They look at ancient place names, like the names of rivers, to tease out clues about the people that lived there. All types of linguistics have the same principles in common. 1. All human beings have the same capacity for language, and there are universal principles that connect all languages, no matter how different they are. 2. All languages work for the people who use them. Linguists don't judge what is right or wrong. They only describe behavior. In fact, linguists obsess about seeking out unusual examples, because the extremes help us test our theories. 3. Linguists study natural language, which means speech and sign language. They don't care about the rules of written language. Writing is only of interest to linguists insofar as it can provide some clues to pronunciation, especially in extinct languages. 4. Linguists follow the scientific method. They collect observations, they formulate theories and models, and then they test them against new observations. Hopefully, this gives you a good idea of what linguists do, why you should hire them, and perhaps why you might want to study linguistics yourself. Thank you for listening.